You deal with cyber attacks. Who are the hackers and what generally are they after?
All right, so I have a 1-minute answer, 3-minute answer, 12-minute answer, 17-minute answer. But at the highest level of abstraction, we deal with 4 different groups. And nation states that are doing compromises, and there's more and more getting on the playing field every day. But it started really in my career with Russian government versus US government type of intrusions. The Russians have a nation state capability, the Chinese have a nation state capability, the Iranians have a nation state capability. So we deal with that, and that's generally the intrusions that are persistent, more complex, and in general, when we respond to those types of intrusions, it's not a 3-day drill to say, here's what the bad guys are doing and here's what to do about it. It's about a 20 to 30-day drill to figure out what happened and another 20 days to figure out what to do about it. So after the nation states, the next thing down is Russian criminal. And I say that, but it includes Ukraine and a few of the ex-Soviet republics. And there's a lot of ways to make money. Wherever commerce goes, crime follows, right? And right now there's so much being bought on the internet that we have a lot of criminal elements on the internet. You may have read or seen something. I know college is an ecosystem where you don't see the news, but there's a company called Target out there, outside the boundaries of Lafayette, that was compromised. It's making a lot of press, but that's Russian criminal. Those are folks that compromised Target, got credit card numbers to fraudulently purchase things, because it's what they do. Yeah. The third group I would call hacktivists, and that's things like potentially the Syrian Electronic Army, the folks from Anonymous, it's just a loosely formed or spontaneously formed group that hacks for causes. There's a company or a group called LulzSec, and we responded to those folks. LulzSec's like an offshoot of an Anonymous group. And then the fourth thing, to me, I would just put the other bucket. It's, you know, if I did nation states are at the top for capability, you come down maybe a small notch for Russian criminal, but quite frankly, the expertise there to hack is excellent. Then you, absolutely, yeah, they have an infrastructure, very well educated, great computer scientists that may not have other means of making a living. But hacking can be very profitable. And so they're like the next rung down. Sometimes they bubble up to nation state capabilities. Sometimes nation states operate at a lower level. Third level is the hacktivist level. You know, if you can be compromised, you will be compromised kind of thing, if you don't patch your systems and do things like that. The other category is a little bit more random, but for the most part, it's the sole actor, the attractive nuisance. You know, somebody gets into a website and just changes it to something like, I love you, Crystal, those sort of things. So those are the 4 groups. The majority of our time is nation state, then Russian criminal. Really, by the time Anonymous compromises somebody, there's not much we can do about it as an entity that comes in to diagnose what happened and what to do about it.
So do these groups ever intermingle?
Great question. You would think, but I haven't seen much. Now, intermingling, yes, the way I define it. Do we ever go to a company that's been breached, and as we respond to that company, say, wow, there's like 5 different groups from China that broke in? Yes, that happens all the time. What's amazing is they seem to work in pretty good concert with one another, meaning almost like they communicate. In Russian criminal, one thing I've observed almost 20 years of responding to these folks is there is some honor amongst thieves, in that if Group A gets into a bank first or gets into a retailer first and steals the card numbers, if another group gets in during that breach, they actually get out. They just stay away because this one kind of owns it, marked their territory. And I've seen that happen. So there's very little overlap because no one profits in the criminal world. Yeah, exactly. You have to coordinate the fraud. You have to pick when you start withdrawing money with stolen ATM cards and pins, or when you start doing fraudulent purchases of things. If you don't coordinate it, you can't maximize the value. So I've seen pretty good coordination. So I think the groups probably know who they are. They can coordinate to some aspect. And we haven't seen one group be combative with another, quite frankly.
So taking America as an example, between a government, a corporation, and the consumer, who should be most worried about being hacked?
Well, for lots of reasons, I don't focus on the consumer because it's very hard to defend the consumer, the people sitting in their homes. It's pretty darn complicated, and that's not what the best hackers are ever going after. We're starting to see a little, to use big phrases, cross-pollination gesture, because what's happening is the attackers used to hack back in 1998. If somebody came to me and said, hack into company A, The way I'd do it is I'd find what's called a vulnerable server, meaning a machine that's listening on the internet for web connections or email connections or something like that. Then we came up with standards, legislation, and regulations that raised the watermark for how secure the servers were. So right around 2002 timeframe, we saw an evolution where the bad guys or the hackers started hacking the end users, which to me is the consumer to some extent. But it's hacking people at their desks through things like IM, instant messaging, or Skype, or email, and breaking in that way. So to defend the enterprise right now, we have a decentralized security problem similar to trying to defend consumers. But it's been my efforts through my career, let's defend the enterprise first. Yes. Correct, because that's where all the resources are. If I'm a bad guy and I hack consumers to get their credit card data, the credit limits are $1,000, $2,000. But if I hack a company and get corporate credit cards, I can get sometimes up to $500,000. Or if I can get Amex, I may have a limitless capability. So normally I see organized crime going after enterprises, and then nation states usually don't hack individuals. The exception would be reporters or legislators, government people. But the nation states do hack companies for intellectual property. So if there's a consumer who's involved in some kind of great project with lots of IP, they might get compromised. But long story short, to get back to the heart of your question, enterprises right now have the biggest problem because there's legislation, standards, or regulations that impact most industries. So enterprises have to do some kind of security, but the consumer doesn't. Consumer just buys something at Best Buy, throws it on their network and goes. So the liabilities for corporations is exceptionally high in cyberspace. The liabilities for consumers, quite frankly, is pretty low for now.
So you just answered who should be most worried about being attacked. Who is most vulnerable to a cyber attack?
Yes, well, most vulnerable is the consumers, period. I mean, there's no doubt about that. Who's most worried? The government and corporations. Those are the folks that think about this on a day in, day out basis. Someone hacks your home computer, it could be embarrassing, meaning if somebody hacked you and took all your email and posted it online, but not too many people really do that. That's an attractive nuisance. Most of the professional hackers aren't wasting that incredible technical talent to embarrass humans. Absolutely right.
So is this solely a problem in the US, or did these attacks get carried out on a global scale?
I think the attacks are happening everywhere, and throughout my career we've responded on every single continent, including Antarctica somehow. I mean, we literally had some kind of computer intrusion where it reached IP addresses pretty darn far away. So the scope of these things crosses borders. But it's been my experience primarily helping international organizations that are headquartered in the United States. It's a problem everywhere, but going through each one, nation states hack nation states. It's often government on government. Some governments follow different rules of engagement. For example, the Chinese government will have military people that wear uniforms, that badge in every day, hack the private sector in Germany, India, the United States. So that's not very fair, but that happens. But Russian criminal in general focuses everywhere, but the US takes the brunt of that onslaught. And the reason why is just we have more credit, we have more credit cards, we have more people doing e-commerce. So in any intrusion where credit cards are stolen, probably over 90% of the credit cards are going to be US credit cards anyway. So that's why we tend to see the most fraud based on just the amount of e-commerce we do.
So what on a grand scale is at risk?
The worst case scenario.
Could the power grid go down? Could financial systems be jeopardized, et cetera?
The potential is pretty high, meaning what bad things can happen. There's a significant amount of bad things that can happen, all depending on the expertise of the adversaries that's trying to kick off the bad things. There's a smart way to do the bad stuff, there's a dumb way to do this, but I don't want to say dumb. The less effective way of doing it. And the good thing about if somebody elevates, whether it be a nation state, or if it's a nation state, by the way, that elevates and shuts down a utility grid or hacks a hospital and people start feeling physical problems based on the electronic attack, the response most likely will not be in cyberspace. And that's a pretty strong deterrent, by the way. Nation states, having responded to Chinese intruders since the mid-90s, so it's been well over almost 2 decades, they've always followed rules of engagement where if the Chinese government broke into the United States, whether it be they broke into our government or our private sector, they wouldn't change your data, they wouldn't destroy or delete anything, And they have always followed that code or rules of engagement, meaning nobody was losing lives. We were just losing IP. If they ratcheted that up a notch and started deleting machines or trying to shut down utilities, most nation states would work with a governance that if they did do that, we're either at war or this is the beginning of it, meaning a beginning of an armed conflict. And the deterrence is, in fact, the US military at that point. So that's a nice thing. But let's come down a notch to sole practitioners and let's say a terrorist group that has 10 really smart doctorate level exploitation development folks. What could they do if they just wanted to cause harm? Right now, a simple analogy, but it's quasi-accurate, is that we're in a glass house. So there can be a pretty good amount of damage done. But a lot of that damage is so obvious that we'd be able to react to it right away and maybe eliminate or limit the consequences of the nefarious act. There are really smart ways to do low and slow economic damage if you can break in to some of the systems that we have in place. And that's what I think depends on what you'd say is the most harmful thing you could do. But to me, a surreptitious attack, nobody notices it till by the time we realize the enormous economic loss, or the more noticeable things like, wow, 5 grids get shut down. Can all that happen in cyberspace? The answer is it can. It's not a trivial thing to do. It would take multiple people, it would take lots of different skill sets, and it could take a long time to get the malware you need in place to execute that in place. But nobody, here's the reality. Right now, I believe whatever attack tries to be that destructive, like let's say it shuts down the grid, we will see failures first. And throughout my career, I've yet to see the failure. Meaning they're not going to get it right the first time a nation state or group tries. The hacker will fail, absolutely. A redundant system will trigger. It's real hard. Well, I've seen some successes, but in the US, I haven't seen a failure of a destructive attack yet, and sometimes you'd see that. Now, the most famous worldwide destructive attacks are, something happened at Saudi Aramco about 2 years ago where somebody released call it a virus, but something went from machine to machine, got on all the machines, and then got a command to delete all the machines. And somewhere between 20 to 40,000 machines erased themselves. That shuts your business down. When everybody's sitting at work one day and their machine gets deleted, it's gone. Another attack that was pretty well publicized was an attack called Stuxnet. And what that did is that was an attack allegedly, according to, I believe the New York Times wrote an article that said Stuxnet was the United States authoring the malware with the Israelis. That malware was somehow positioned into a nuclear reaction plant or a nuclear plant in Iran, and it destroyed over 900 centrifuges. So you can imagine almost a decision-making process that says, we don't want nuclear proliferation in Iran. We don't have the means to inspect it. If we drop bombs in on it, everybody's going to see that. So let's try this cyber thing and see if we can destroy things. And it came back a confirmation that there was physical destruction from a cyber attack. So those things have started. I believe they both probably were nation-state level attacks, but it hasn't become widespread just yet.
How do companies and governments collaborate to prevent against cyber attacks?
How do the governments collaborate to protect against cyber attacks?
And also a company like a U.S. corporation.
Right, yeah. Starting with companies, in general, companies have aligned by industry to safeguard themselves. For example, in the defense industrial base, the Lockheed Martins of the world, the Raytheons, the General Dynamics, the Northrop Grummans, what they've learned is the attackers that attack any one of us attack all of us. And so let's figure out a way to share information in a meaningful way so that if one of us does get a cyber attack, the rest of us can kind of benefit from it. You know what I mean? So there's almost a network enabler of let's share information and let's have a community defense to it. Same things happen in the financial services. All the banks have aligned under a thing called a Financial Services Information Sharing and Assurance Center, FSISAC, and it's gotten better and better. And so you have those two industries. You have the utilities have aligned to some extent, the retailers are aligning, and that makes sense because the attackers that hack into a bank, generally that's what they do. Banks have similar applications and similar architectures, and attackers need to get familiar with those to be effective when they break in. The attackers that hack into the defense industrial base are usually different people. The folks who would target a utility would need to have utility-based expertise along with their hacking expertise. So it's a good alignment. Government to government, there's all these international consortiums that share information, share attack methods, and things like that. But I think it's going to be a long time before we have good government-to-government information sharing in cyberspace, because we're still honing. We're 25 years into this whole issue of hacking and responding and trying to deal with things. And we're just getting to the point where we're sharing information effectively for community defense in the private sector. I think in the public sector, government to government, information shared at a high level, but it'll be a while before we can share at what I call network speed with actionable threat intelligence.
You've mentioned the alignment within and between industries in regard to protecting against cyber attacks. Do you envision that there will ever be a time when these industries and these methods will converge?
Meaning have everybody...
Everyone be able to say, hey, this sort of attack came to us.
Right. In general, if you're going to share information about an attack, you can share globally with everybody within some kind of ecosystem, and you may have numerous ecosystems, just like Facebook, where you pick which friends you share certain things with and tag them. You can do the same thing with threat intelligence when you had an attack and you want to share information. I think that it'll always have an alignment by industry just because the attacks look similar, and in general, when there's a cyber attack, it'll hit the whole industry. In my career, if one bank called me saying, hey, we're having a cyber attack today, so did 5 other banks. That's just the way it goes down. So, and what you need to do to defend the whole institution of banking, they all have a vested interest. Let's get together. If NASDAQ, let's say, gets attacked, all the exchanges globally will probably start working together, figure out how to deal with those things, because there's a dependence or interdependence between them. So I believe there will always be an alignment by industry. There will also be an alignment where some cyber attack happens in this industry and they realize, hey, this is an attack no one's seen before. Let's see if we can proliferate that knowledge outside our industry and outside our doors. Right now, it's even complicated. I think we're honing it so we can do it by industry. But if you want to communicate to the world, the frustration with that is the minute you do that, you're basically showing your cards to the attacker, and it's a frustrating thing. That's why I've always said when it comes to what we're talking about is threat intelligence, the ability to, if there's a compromise at company A today, everybody's defended by tomorrow. You can't operate that way if you're always sharing everything with the whole world. That's the challenge. So at some point, the threat intelligence you're sharing, it needs to have some kind of boundary to it, or else the bad guys know as much as the good guys. And that's why I think what you'll see is that the threat intelligence sharing that aligns by industry, there's a thing called critical infrastructures, like the financial services is a critical infrastructure, utilities, energy is a critical infrastructure. Somehow there's like 21 of these things. There used to be like 6 when we first started categorizing it. But there's a bunch. And I think what you'll see is threat intelligence sharing amongst the critical infrastructure, first and foremost, to make sure the cyber attacks don't, in fact, impact those as badly as they could if we didn't share. Yes, the challenge is, where does the critical infrastructure stop and regular networks start? And there's that demarcation line is not always a bright line.
Are there any best practices concerning cybersecurity, and do you think that there's any company or government that can serve as a model of these best practices?
There are. I probably won't say which companies are the best model, and I certainly won't say which ones aren't. But I can tell you in general, when a nation state attacks a company, it's not always reasonable for a company to be able to withstand that attack. There's always a way in. Whether you get an insider to do something wrong by paying them, or the old school not cyber espionage, but espionage, or you just get a company to hire your people. There's so many ways to do it. In many regards, if you keep out a nation state that wants your IP in cyberspace, you'll have a personnel security problem, because you'll end up hiring somebody that steals your secrets. So in general, there's a lot of companies doing a tremendous effort to keep, first and foremost, the drive-by shootings on the internet to a minimum. That's the non-targeted attacks, and being able to address, if we are compromised by a very advanced hacker, let's eliminate the consequences, at least know it. Because a lot of companies get compromised, they don't know it for over 200 days. So, and when it comes to the government, it starts with our military, and it permeates. You have absolute A's with resilient networks. If they get compromised, they know it. They can eliminate most of the consequences of the breach, and it goes from that extreme down to, quite frankly, at the lower end of great cybersecurity are academia, state governments, places where in academia you staunchly defend First Amendment rights. Mostly it's open networks. Everybody can bring in their own equipment. You have very stovepiped institutions where, as we sit here today, someone's probably plugging in a machine they bought it from Best Buy into some network here. It's just hard to defend it. And at the same time frame, state governments are dealing with legacy technologies, 20 years old, 30 years old, and they don't have the people resources or even the technical resources to defend it. So military is the best, no doubt in my mind. They have a standing army of defenders doing what they can. There's real risks or repercussions if they're compromised, down to, and I don't mean this in a bad way, it's just a risk versus rewards decisions made by people. Universities, academia, state governments are down near the bottom rung.
So basically, the company who can protect best against cyber attacks is one who can constantly have surveillance and have constant security.
Right, but it's unaffordable. I mean, no company can do, companies are in business to be profitable. The military is in business to defend the country. So they're not worried about a return on investment there, other than we win. So we can't be comparable to that. You can't build military-like defenses into commercial America. You can come close, but you won't always get there. And by the way, there's I literally have a whole gradient of from industry A to industry Z where they all fit on this continuum, but I don't think everybody wants to hear that.
So how exactly do you track down the hackers, and does the law ever impede your investigations in any way?
No. No, so when we get hired by a victim company. They've been compromised. We are acting on their behalf to figure out basically only two things: what happened, what to do about it. More companies find out they've been compromised from external parties than they find it themselves. And I've tracked this since the mid-90s. It used to be in 1998, if a company knew it was compromised, they detected it themselves, and it was, their IT security folks working in the basement watching an intrusion detection system and seeing a blip on the radar. Fast forward to from 2005 till now, the majority of the intrusions into the companies that hire us, the government detects it first. And that doesn't mean the government's watching every packet on the internet. What it does mean is that there's threat actors from China and Russia that the government does monitor. That if there's an intrusion, you can recognize intrusions on the internet if you know what to look for. And what will happen is the government will tell a company, your IP has been stolen, and here's a little bit of data about that intrusion. And then the company just goes, wow, how did that happen? How long did it happen ago? And then there's a flurry of activity to figure out how, what is the scope of the incident, and how do we get these guys off our networks? So we have specific statistics, but about 3 years ago, 95% we had about 140 companies hire us 3 years ago, and 95% of them first learned they were compromised from the US government. That's a pretty high percentage. Now you go to the retailers. The retailers usually learn they were compromised by Secret Service, FBI, or the card brands. They're not self-detecting or self-diagnosing they've been compromised. And it's usually called a common point of purchase, where there'll be maybe, let's say, 100 accounts of fraud on credit cards, where people are calling in and saying, hey, my credit card's been fraudulently used. And Visa will run some algorithms and say, hey, these 100 accounts that have fraud on them, they all went to store A and bought something 3 weeks ago. And that's called a common point of purchase. So very few people are doing self-detection right now, meaning it's higher than what it used to be, but I'd say it's about 35 to 40% of companies that get breached are doing self-detection. And then once there's self-detection, or you've been notified, from the moment you were breached to the moment you knew it, is still well over 100 days. It's not a good thing.
So are you still hired by the companies that do use self-detection?
They are, yes, because by the time they self-detect, they just go, wow, how long have they been in our network? And then we have the ability to scale and look at every single machine, look at, overturn every single rock and say, hey, they've been on your network for 5 months. They've accessed these 500 machines. They've taken these files, and they're using these 7 user IDs and passphrases today to log on to things. And that's the one thing for 100% of the attacks that we have responded to for 10 years, whoever breaks in goes to using user IDs and passphrases that work on the network. So they get in to these victim networks using malware and exploits, and usually getting a human to hack himself in general. And once they get in, they immediately stop using the malware. They start accessing the network in the same way the company accesses its own resources. So they're very hard to detect.
So they'll get in and then they sort of get the layout,
Yep.
understand the layout before they make the.
Well, what they'll do is they'll masquerade as your users. So if they break into company A, they start immediately logging in as company A employees. And it's frustrating, but right now the majority of the operating systems we use, you can get to the user accounts and passphrases if you can compromise the machine. So, and then you just use them. So if I compromise your machine read, I'd easily be able to figure out in minutes what your user ID and passphrase was to log into that machine. And then anything that's logged into your machine, I'd also get its user account and passphrase. At most companies, yeah, you got it. So at most companies, they have accounts that work on every machine. And the reason they do that is they want to have their system administrators be able to upload a patch, and a patch is nothing but an executable file, run that file to upgrade the security of their machines. So in the name of security, we will have one account that logs into maybe 150,000 machines and places safeguards on it. But that account, the minute it successfully logs into all 150,000 machines, as a bad guy, I only need to get Jane Doe to hack herself with some spear phishing email. And if I can hack her machine, I will get that one account and its passphrase as well, and it works everywhere. Yeah, so that's the problem. Every company has accounts that work on every machine, because otherwise you'd have to walk to every machine uploading things by hand. That's the advantage of the network. We've written software that makes that a little bit harder to do, but in general, that's why these guys get such widespread access the minute they break in. Liken it to, once they get in, they're inside the castle. There's no moat to crack. And once you're on the inside, you've got everything.
So when you're trying to figure out what happened, do you first go through the whole network and then to each machine, or how does that all work?
So here's what we do. Perfect world, and we do this probably well over 90% of the time. We start collecting data off the network. That means look at data in transit. We also review, I call it, do a deep dive and interrogate or investigate every single endpoint we can. And at Mandia, what we did in 2004 at our company is we started using a schema to communicate what the threat intelligence, or what I call, let's just say, the trace evidence of every attack looks like. So if we ever responded to an intrusion at company A, when our folks investigated company A, they'd come out with a file that says, here's the trace evidence of what we found at company A. And then we could plug that file into our software and say, let's go look for that trace evidence at companies B, C, D, E, and F. So we have 10 years right now of threat intelligence from every breach we've ever responded to. And it's very unique. So if we say, hey, we found what happened at company A, at company D, we know who the actors are, what they normally do, what other malware they use, and we can find them a lot quicker. So we investigate the endpoints, we monitor the network, and we know what to look for at both. Because as I say, evil looks different on each one. On the endpoints, you find what's called malware, executable files that do bad things. Or you find encrypted files that when we unencrypt them and uncompress them, well, we now know if we could unencrypt it and could uncompress it, what attacker put it there in the first place, if that makes sense, because we've figured out a lot of the ways they do those things. And then how evil looks on the network is totally different, because it's all encrypted half the time anyway. Or they use protocols on the network that are, they appear standard to the untrained eye, but then when you get inside, you recognize an encoding schema and a way to decode it or decrypt it. So I'm giving you nerdy stuff right now. So I'll stop answering before you fall asleep. Collect data off the network, collect and investigate every machine for evidence, and in concert between those two things, you can figure out what happened and what to do about it.
The segment in which we're making is in regard to the crypto economy. And so we've seen a rise in crypto transactions. Do you think that this is driven out of an increased need for security, or do you think that it's driven out of a need for privacy?
Well, that depends on what lens you look at the whole argument from. It is my opinion, after 20 years of doing cybersecurity, that it is probably more a privacy issue and more an anonymity issue to have currency that has no sovereign power governing it. It's so that you can do things more anonymously. Because I feel pretty secure dealing with US dollars. And so I don't think it's a security issue, it's a privacy issue.
I guess to further push that question.
Let me add this. Any insecurities you have with one currency, quite frankly, I think you have with another currency. And you saw that with Bitcoin. There's a compromise, and since it's just it's data storage of currency, and do people feel more secure about data currency than an actual physical bill? I mean, last I checked, they lost something. And there's nothing more ephemeral, big use of the word ephemeral, but there's nothing more ephemeral than electronic data can be deleted. So I think it's a privacy issue. People want to be able to anonymously purchase things, and one way to get there is to have currency that has no sovereign power governing it.
So the flip side of that question is, do you think that people's security is being compromised by something like Bitcoin, which is supposed to promote privacy?
When I think of Bitcoin, I line it to, throughout my history, I've always seen things on the internet that have allowed people to profit from the internet and make it harder to pierce anonymity behind who that was. And Bitcoin seems similar to me than that. I'm not saying it is or isn't, but it comes down to a fundamental question. I hate to say it, and this will sound wrong, but I could tie everything you're asking into this debate. Are governments good or bad? Because, I hate to say it, that's what it comes down to. Because you either trust your government to do the right things, or if when you don't trust them, you want total anonymity. If we had total anonymity on the internet, period, I can tell you right now there are probably ways to do that. That will come with its own consequences. If we have no anonymity on the internet, that will come with consequences as well. So where's the right balance? And that'll be an eternal debate. We're never going to get there. But Bitcoin is a reaction to being able to anonymously buy stuff, transfer things, have a currency that no one can govern, period. And maybe that's right, but I think what it is it's over in an extreme on that whole debate. When you look at security versus privacy, the more privacy everybody has, one may be able to argue that that introduces a little bit of insecurity. Some may argue that. Yeah. On the flip side, if nobody has privacy, you may promote officious governments that simply take advantage of their people. And I can put it this way too, it's an interesting debate. We've had it for 15 years in DC, but one of the things I saw debated once is, I don't know about you, but when I'm typing on Google, I can finish what I'm thinking. Just a computer does that. It's just an algorithm. I don't feel bad about that. And then I'll log into Amazon, and Amazon will tell me, here's the 10 things you should buy. I've actually gone outside once in my cell phone. I don't even remember what app it was, but it was actually telling me what Italian restaurants were nearby, because I like Italian restaurants. So we already have private sector algorithms that are learning about you, your shopping patterns, what you may buy, where you're at, and associating with your shopping patterns to tell you where to go. And I've even heard Amazon can read minds, and they will send you stuff before you buy it. And that's pretty cool. And by the way, they'll probably get it right. And somebody said, from the government, someone from the government said, hey, you know what? You're already losing your privacy to Amazon, because they know what you're buying and they're taking advantage of it. But the differences are that Amazon can't legally break down your door and seize your assets, and a government can. So what a government can do with that same type of knowledge, some people are afraid of, some people aren't. But the debate you're going at with Bitcoin, quite frankly, comes back to how empowered do you want a government?
So do you feel that cyber warfare is making this push towards more secrecy and encrypted transactions?
There are a lot of things changing the landscape in cyberspace right now. First, processing power, because with processing power comes the ability to analyze big data, right? And cheap storage, fast storage. So now if we collect everything, we can process it, analyze it, apply advanced algorithms to it and learn. Like Amazon can tell me what I'm going to buy. That's pretty cool. With those technical advancements, possibilities to perform espionage or perform what you think are processes that are integral to security that you couldn't have done 10 years ago. That the more you collect, the more you know. And that's a very tempting thing when we're only, 80 years removed from trying to break Enigma codes. So so technical changes are changing the landscape on how governments think about how they can perform their functions. But with big data and the ability to do all that analysis, I think most likely comes a loss of privacy, simply because the power is there to kind of track us. I mean, there's more data being collected on all of us today than ever before. Our geolocations via our cell phones. I bet right now, Googles of the world, the Amazons of the world, the major cloud providers of the world, YouTube, Microsoft, if you use a lot of their products, they know the names of all your devices, what your iPad's named, what your iPhone's named. They probably can go back 5 devices for you. They probably even have the serial numbers for those devices. Now, upside of that, you can get more secure email because you can actually have email configured to just go to your device. The downside is they know where you've been. You can link that data with AT&T data or Verizon data, and I've got a lot of information. So we have more data than ever on each one of us, and the ability to search it. I just see a decrease in privacy over the future. There's a greater chance